informative and interesting and thought-provoking. My name is Paulo von Schirach, and I am the president of the Global Policy Institute and also serve as professor of political science and international relations here at Bay Atlantic University. This event today is part of a series of events that we at GPI, Global Policy Institute, arrange in coordination with the university to bring outside experts to the classroom, if you wish, so that we can enrich the academic experience, learning experience by exposing our students to very interesting people who bring a different angle and different light to the topics that we are discussing. Specifically, this event is in conjunction with my class. I teach this semester class on U.S. foreign policy, broadly understood, after 9/11, as it were, which is something our guest today is extremely familiar with. And so we will discuss, he will present to us his own angle about many aspects of what happened back then and also the relevance in terms of lessons of experience, I guess, lessons learned or not learned, and how they may apply to more contemporary issues. So as you may have seen from the information we sent out, we have here Mr. Harun Hakimi, who is an old friend. We've known each other for many years when he was serving at the Embassy of Afghanistan here in Washington, D.C. And also, accidentally, we discovered we were neighbors because he was, at the time, he was pursuing a higher degree at American University, which happens to be close by. And so I guess logistics made it convenient for him to be in the neighborhood. So we had many opportunities to exchange ideas and thoughts and lots of conversations, lots of meetings. Harun is also a friend of the university. He was kind enough to, point out the academic opportunities here to many members of the Afghan diaspora here in the Washington area. And thanks to him, we had many interesting and very gifted Afghan students, both undergraduate and graduate. So we're very thankful for that. Well, I guess I'll leave it to him to explain more about his career. He's going back to Afghanistan, what happened, and many other things related to that, and how he thinks that experience, which is still kind of burning, it's not, the fact that he's here now and not in Kabul tells you something about what happened in Afghanistan, but I'll leave this to him. So Harun, why don't you take over and tell everybody here, to our students and to the audience that is with us joining virtually via Zoom, tell us what we need to learn. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's not on, right?
I think it is.
Is it? Okay. Always pleasure talking to you and sharing thoughts with you, and happy to meet you all. Good morning to you all, and to those. Sure. Yes. All right. So I should hold it closer. Thank you for the introduction as well. As you mentioned, yes, I was working for the Afghan government until August 15th, the day of the collapse of the Afghan government in Kabul. There are a lot to talk about, but when I was asked to talk about the lessons learned from Afghanistan or Ukraine, which is a buzz topic in DC circles now, and there are developments. There will be a call between President Trump and President Putin on Tuesday, and there will be a summit of the EU leaders coming Thursday. This was popping up in my mind to talk about the experiences we went through. Is there anyone from Ukraine? Not here, might be someone online. But talk about Ukraine, we feel it more deeply because we have a lot of similarities. We were also invaded by Russia, Soviet Union of the time, 1979. And since then, Afghanistan has been going from one war to another. And then afterwards, we had also something like the peace talks, and there was the US involved, and there were other countries, there was EU, there was NATO. And eventually, as Mr. Paulo mentioned, we lost to the Taliban, to the opposite group. And as you mentioned, I'm here. I didn't want to be here this way. During the last days of my mission here in DC in 2020, I remember the conversations I had with you. You were surprised that
I told you not to go.
yeah, not to go. I said, no, I should go, and there should be people like me back in Afghanistan to serve. But we were kind of forced to leave in a very unexpected way. And a C-17 with more than 800 people, we were not counted. We were just forced to leave. So that's why I wanted to talk like what we went through and what miscalculations we had made at that time, and what the Ukrainian leaders should consider while dealing with the strongest supporter, the United States, while going to the negotiation tables and afterwards. So yeah, I'm happy to go and start with you, Mr. Paul.
Okay, well, why don't we, again, because we haven't really covered this in my class, at least we haven't covered this more recent. Well, we have. We covered the history of the American intervention, right? After 9/11, which I suppose almost everybody is familiar with. There was, everybody kind of knew almost immediately after 9/11, U.S. intelligence said, okay, that's Bin Laden, okay. And where is Bin Laden? Well, he's in Afghanistan. And who is protecting him? The Taliban and all that. So that all this is ancient history, but that was the how can I say, the trigger for the American intervention. And then that morphed into something much, much more ambitious, and you know extremely well all the details of that. How that, what was supposed to be a short military operation became a 20-year plus experience with extremely ambitious goals on the part, not just of the United States, but the NATO countries that participated, and I suppose with participation, at least of some Afghans, to say, okay, this is an opportunity to modernize the country, to make it something completely different. And you, better than most people, know that how difficult that is, it was, and how there were some successes, no doubt, but how complicated it was. But I think it would be very important if you can walk us through the difficult years which prior to the collapse of the Ghani government, of which you were part. He has not mentioned that he served as a vice minister, when he went back to Kabul so part of the, the ruling policymakers. And so the question is, what went wrong based on your experience? That would be very important in the years prior to the collapse of the government and the return of the Taliban in 2021. What, in your judgment, what went wrong? And also, if you can explain the kind of unusual format of negotiations that were undertaken by the United States government with the Taliban. How did that play out? The venue, which I think was in Doha, it's always the place where people meet these days, including now, regarding Gaza or other places. In what position this placed the Ghani government, of which you were part? If you can elaborate on that. And in other words, what is it that was not going well in Afghanistan, notwithstanding years of interventions and funding for this and funding for that, coming from the US, from the Europeans, from the Japanese, from the Australians, from the Saudis. Give us a picture of what was Afghanistan like in, let's say, 2016, 17, well after the first invasion, and what were the struggles, what were the issues you were, as an Afghan officials, as a government officials, that you were confronted with, and what were your hopes and expectations, and how did you view the negotiations that were beginning to shape up?
Let me start from 2002, 2001, when after 9/11, on October 7th, the US invaded Afghanistan. The Taliban regime could not resist, and within 40 days, they left the whole country. The Taliban leader and the founder, Mullah Omar, whose son is now the Minister of Defense of the Taliban, Mullah Omar was finding a way to talk to Hamid Karzai, at that time not a president, at that time leading a force in Kandahar, to talk to him and ask for amnesty, a pardon, so he can live in Afghanistan. But when Karzai sent the message to Pentagon at that time, Donald Rumsfeld, rejected that.
By the way, for those of you who don't remember or don't know, then Secretary of Defense.
Yes.
Okay.
So his response was, we should bring them to justice, or justice to them. And I guess it was one of our first mistakes that we refused talking to the Taliban. This would have changed the entire scenario of the Taliban, because if their leaders had not left Afghanistan at that time, not forced to go to Pakistan and get regrouped back there, we would have a different Afghanistan today.
Maybe you want to, sorry to interrupt, but you want to explain that it was easy for the Taliban to move from Afghanistan to Pakistan, because basically they're all Pashto, they're all same people, speak the same language, they're probably related, family-wise to each other. And so the Taliban was defeated, but really moved out.
Yeah.
More than being.
But more than the ethnic or linguistic ties with the people on the other side of the Duran line, which is over 2,500 kilometers between Afghanistan and Pakistan. There is a government there in Pakistan that's always supporting anti-Afghan government groups for its stability. It's been the policy of Pakistan for the past, you can say, 5 decades, supporting groups against Afghanistan. So the Taliban went to Pakistan and got support of the Pakistani government and regrouped and started fighting the Afghan forces and the US forces in Afghanistan until 2021. The first lesson learned was that talking was always the best option. So we should have had the conversations with them. Second thing was, when the Taliban, when after almost a decade, the US felt that, yeah, we need to talk to them, then some secret channels brought some Taliban leaders to Doha to open an office for them and make them talk with the Afghan government. At that time, President Karzai rejected the office. He didn't like the idea. He had a chance. At that time, if there was any peace deal, it could be like a few ministries given to the Taliban, a few offices given to the Taliban, or at least let them come and live in Afghanistan. But the government, Karzai's government, rejected everything. And afterwards, again, there were chances, there were opportunities for both the sides, but the Afghan government was not in a mood to talk to them.
But this is a very important point, Harun. Can you elaborate? Do you think that if that offer had been made, including the very first one, when you say Mullah Omar defeated in the field, say, hey, can I have amnesty? And Karzai goes to the Americans and says, is that okay? And they say, no. Yeah, honestly, I didn't know about that. So thank you for bringing this up. Do you think, with the wisdom of hindsight, that could have led to a genuine reconciliation?
It could.
Between the various sides? Because again, everybody should not forget that the Taliban were sort of an incidental participant in this whole thing. The problem with the United States was not with the Taliban, it was with Al-Qaeda, which were hosted by the Taliban. But we didn't have a beef with the Taliban. We didn't want to go. We went to war with them because they were hosting willingly Bin Laden, and they didn't want to give him up. And so they say, okay, if you're friends with Al-Qaeda, well, then you are complicit. And for that reason, we're going to come in and get rid of your government. But there wasn't really a specific issue with the Taliban beyond this.
You're right. And even at that time, if you read the very accurate or trusted account of the incidents written by Steve Cole, an American journalist, its name is Directorate S. He mentions that while the US was planning to attack the Taliban regime at that time, the Taliban had some meetings to hand over Bin Laden, or to force him to leave the country and to make a deal with the US. So they were in negotiations, or they had some meetings going on, but there was kind of hurry and an urgency in the Pentagon here to start the war, while the CIA was busy talking with the Taliban, and the CIA had found some high-level assets within the Taliban at that time. He talks in details about this. Those scenarios could change the entire situation or the outcomes we saw in 2021. First, Mullah Omar was the founder of the Taliban, the most trusted and charismatic person. While he was a different kind of personality, but Taliban still, he was the founder of the group. While if he could stay in Afghanistan, no one of his commanders could go against his wish or will and start the war. Any kind of war could be a small insurgency, not a full spectrum or a full-fledged war like his people did.
But let me press this a little further. Do you think, again, with the wisdom of hindsight, that his offer, his request was genuine to say, we can live together?
Yes.
We're not going to use this opportunity to infiltrate, if you wish, the new government, the Karzai government, to create a mess, to start an insurrection again against this government and take over. Once the Americans are gone, then we take over again. Do you think that was a genuine effort of power sharing that they would have?
I think he had no capacity to do any mess inside the country after any kind of amnesty or a new government. He could be managed inside with like vigilance and everything. Like, he could not do any harm to the government or to the structure in the system. One. Secondly, as I mentioned, he was a charismatic person, but he was an uneducated person. He had very little religious education, nothing more. He could not do anything else. But what I was there. I was almost 9 or 10. I saw how scared the Taliban were from the U.S. aircrafts, and I saw how soon they left. And I still remember the sounds of the bombing when I was there. The Taliban could not resist, and they could not do any harm. And there were many other groups. The Taliban leaders could also live there. But that was the first stage we actually missed, or opportunity we missed. The second was the Doha office opening. I remember President Karzai had a press conference, and he criticized not only the Taliban's office, but Richard Holbrooke. In criticizing Richard Holbrooke, who was
maybe you want to tell them who he was.
He was United States representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan within the State Department. He was a tough guy, and the criticism of Holbrooke actually worsened the relations between Karzai and the White House. And then afterwards, we saw that there were many other opportunities for peace talks in the earlier stages, but we missed. Going to the 2018, in 2017, President Trump announced his South Asia strategy, in which he focused on Afghanistan. Again, staying in Afghanistan. Otherwise, during the campaigns for the elections of 2016, his plan was to withdraw from Afghanistan, to end the war. But when he went to the White House, his advisors, his team, his circles, all insisted on staying in Afghanistan. That's why in August 2017, he announced his South Asia strategy to stay in Afghanistan, hit the enemy harder, and force them to agree to peace talks. And in 2018, when he appointed Zalmay Khalilzad, former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, to Iraq, and to the United Nations,
and a native,
a native Afghan.
Yes.
So he appointed him as a representative for the peace talks, and that was another stage. In this stage, Taliban had gained a bigger portion of the Afghan territory. They had increased in numbers, and their threat and risk and everything was multiplied by a bigger number. And Taliban had an upper hand at that time.
May I ask you again? We're still talking about now, since we know how badly things ended. But how is it possible that with all of the interventions, with all the money spent in the country, with all the money spent, as you know, on training the Afghan police and armed forces, with the billions of dollars of equipment provided by the United States, how come that the Taliban managed to make substantial inroads, towards the end of the decade? How do you explain it? Is it because of, people say, oh, it was corruption, or it was, what was it? In other words, one would have thought that all this money, all these things, all this goodwill would have produced some support for the government and not for the Taliban. Instead, something went wrong.
Many things, including including the rule of the corruption you mentioned. Corruption was not only within the Afghan government. Corruption was within the foreign aid programs. Corruption was within the contracts given by the NATO members, by the EU members, by all those sponsoring nations. Corruption was, you might have seen in the cigar reports, was everywhere. It was not only the Afghan government. And there was another point, that warlords in Afghanistan. Warlords posed a serious threat than corruption to the legitimacy of the government, to the rule of law, and also to the implementation of the policies, strategies, and plans for the reconstruction of the country. And in addition to that, there were enemies of the United States in Afghanistan, both supporting and sponsoring the groups against the government. When toppling the Taliban regime in 2001, the US thought that it created an alliance but it was a pre-made alliance that the US joined. It was India, it was Iran, it was Russia, and later on Pakistan, and some other countries of the region. These countries in the Bonn Conference, 2001 and 2002, in 2002, they actually acted like they are on the same page with the US, but they were not. They were having their own proxy groups within the country. And in the meantime, they were supporting the insurgents against the US. So all of these I have written a paper, it's around 120 pages, which is about what went wrong in Afghanistan. There I have highlighted 14 main reasons or causes that weakened the Afghan government and that led to the collapse. But coming back to the point that, yes, Afghan government was at that time a weakened government, and in some ways delegitimized, also not by the warlords within, but by the US. Delegitimized in many ways. I remember when Karzai cried to the public that, hey, people, I don't have any control over the night raids that the US forces or NATO forces are doing and killing innocent people. He could not control that. That was delegitimizing. And then people were telling him, so you are just a puppet. You don't have any power to prevent this. So you are not a president. I remember once in Panjwai district of Kandahar, an American soldier had killed 16 members of a family. He was drunk, I guess. He had just walked away from his base and killed the people. And then the only member of the family was sitting to President Karzai in the palace in front of the media. And he said, give us the answer. He said, I don't have the answer. This was delegitimizing the government. So a delegitimized, weakened, and in the meantime, corrupt government. I was a part of it. All the officials were not corrupt. There were people who were working for the country. But you might have read a bigger percentage of the officials also was affected by the corruption. Coming to the point when in 2018 we saw that President Trump decided to change his mind because the South Asia policy is not working, and the military approach has no results that he expected. So he's assigned Zal Khalilzad, and Zal started his talks with the Taliban. The Taliban had an upper hand. They didn't want to talk to the Afghan government. They said, well, the Afghan government has nothing to do. You, the US, we want to talk to you. And they excluded the Afghan government. In the meantime, the US also agreed to talk to the Taliban without any representative of the Afghan government. So this is the lesson that talking or peace talks, the soonest the better. If you see that you're losing and you're losing the leverage, you're losing your cards, the soonest the better to talk. So I think this is a very good lesson for Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And when the talks again, I remember we saw our national security advisor, who was your friend also, and my former boss. He came to DC and he criticized the US government. And he criticized Zal Khalilzad for delegitimizing and excluding the Afghan government, and he made some statements. The expectation was that his statements will force the US to listen to the Afghan government, but the result was otherwise. It was considered as disrespect to the US government, and it lowered the place of the Afghan embassy. I was a diplomat here at that time, and dealing with the US institutions or here with the State Department. I remember after that, we didn't have proper access after that, we lost ground in the talks and in many aspects. I remember it was not a right decision to criticize the U.S. publicly, to criticize the U.S. decisions. And one more thing, in some cases, some foreign officials think that attacking an individual within the U.S. government will be considered something personal or attack on a person. But no, it's not like that. President Karzai criticized Holbrooke, which turned to be a kind of criticism of the U.S. system government. And the same was our national security advisor's criticism of Zal. And Zal got more power. And then the Afghan government got more excluded. And then the Afghan government was even not informed of the developments of the peace talks, somehow as a reaction. So I think this is something similar to the remarks of President Zelenskyy in the White House. People perceived him as disrespectful of a very strong and decisive president and his vice president. So I think a lesson learned from Afghanistan could be very helpful for talking to the U.S. Officials, especially leaders. And one more point that I chronologically should have mentioned before. In 2013, Afghanistan had a jirga, a grand assembly of the elders and leaders of the country from across the country in Kabul. It was about signing, whether to sign or not, a bilateral security agreement with the U.S. The U.S. wanted military bases, promising protection and security of Afghanistan and support to the Afghan security forces and much more. Karzai at that time wanted to hear from the people whether they want this agreement to be signed or not. So elders and leaders from across the country gathered in Kabul. They talked for 3 days. And at the end, they decided and they voted for signing the agreement. But President Karzai once came to the conclusion and he asked them, what's your decision? They said, we want this signed. But he said, no, against the jirga. He said, listen to me. I want to do politics. I want to do politics and deal with the U.S. the right way. He said that the U.S. is not leaving this country. This country is very important, a strategic location for the U.S. And he kind of repeatedly told the people that, look, the U.S. is not leaving. And he didn't sign it. He went against the decision of the jirga. It was something rare. No one goes against the decision of the jirga. It's a traditional institution that if anyone goes in traditional ways against the jirga, then he is kind of excluded from those social norms or not being trusted anymore. But Karzai went against this and he left the BSA unsigned to the next president, President Ashraf Ghani. And one of his first things was to sign it. And I think it was the first days of his presidency. But the people took that in mind that the US is not leaving. It was a misconception. It was a miscalculation. And when the talks in 2018 started, again, that was something repeated in the minds of the Afghan leaders for years, that the US is not leaving and they won't leave. But everything has an end. Everything comes to an end. So we should have calculated that the right way. So coming back to the points, Afghan government, when started talking about the US Taliban talks, I remember, then again, there were many things that we mistook, actually, or we took the wrong way. In the beginning, the US insisted on postponing the elections, the second term elections for presidential candidates in Afghanistan in 2019. The point was to let the peace or the peace talks a chance. So after the peace talks is over, then you will have the elections. It was 2019. I remember I was a part of the meetings in the Department of State. We were told to go for the peace talks. But at that time, President Ashraf Ghani was thinking that if he's the president, then the election, the peace talks will go smoothly. Otherwise, if he's not, then he will be an acting president. He will not be a legitimate president. His 5 years term will come to an end, and there will be a vacuum of power. So he said no, elections first. There was a conflict. The US insisted on peace first, and President Ghani insisted on elections first. And I remember we again made a mistake. We relied on EU. Europe Union kind of promised that they will support the elections. They will support the Afghan stance on or the choice President Ghani had made, not the US. We are the Afghan. I was not in the policy makers or a member of the policy, but I was having access to it because I was a diplomat in DC, and we used to watch everything closely. That was something that's, I think, now being considered by Zelenskyy. EU members relying on Europe and not only without the US. Without the US, EU, NATO, and other institutions may not have a leadership that can support Ukraine.
If I may interrupt, just let's delve a little more deeply into this, because you hinted at some analogies. Don't be perceived as rude. I guess that would be one lesson of experience, pretty mundane. Do not be too vocal in your stating your points, and you cited Ambassador Mohib, right, whom I remember being not exactly in this room, but I think we're on the third floor when you kindly, or others, I forgot, was you or somebody else who organized that event, and he later on moved to become the national security advisor to President Ghani. So, but now you look at Ukraine, and obviously it's a different situation. At the time you had the Taliban coming back into the country, notwithstanding years of modernization and upgrades and military aid and monetary aid, and I'm still trying to explain my students. I remember the story of the compressed natural gas station that cost $50 million. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Yes, pretty expensive. If you are in the fuel distribution system, and it costs you $50 million in Afghanistan, to build, and nobody knows how that happened. This is Pentagon money, right? If I'm not mistaken. So that's another pearl of the mismanagement of aid, etc. But now you're saying a few interesting things. You said you are essentially the weak part. So you are the government of Afghanistan back then. Now you are the government of Ukraine today. You were relying on American help, and then things are problematic. You've got a problem because, well, you had the Taliban, Zelensky's got the Russians. So try to elaborate more on these analogies. And you say, by the way, don't buy alternatives. America is still the big boy, and you don't antagonize America. Don't say, oh, the EU is going to help, because in the end, maybe they want to, but they don't have the resilience, the strength, the staying power. Elaborate on that, because it kind of gets interesting here.
Yes. So that was the perception that if the U.S. is not supporting the elections, if the U.S. is not with us, then the EU was with us. And I think this is the same thing now in Ukraine's case. But EU, first of all, needs a leadership. EU came to Afghanistan led by the US. And EU in Ukraine followed the lead of the US. If the US is not there, if the US is not leading EU, I think there will be some internal issues within the EU as well, and within NATO, and with all the supporters are the backers. So I think relying on that won't be a good idea. So that's one of the points I want to make, and I won't go to much of the details, but I will go to some other points in this process. When related to this, when the U.S. decided to leave Afghanistan soon after, during the earlier stages, EU was not on the same page, but then they also left. They left the same time frame.
So in other words, there was some thought in Kabul, the Americans may be on their way out, but the Europeans are here, they're going to stay, they're going to help
Yes.
us, even including militarily.
Yes.
Because obviously many of the NATO countries that were part of the force, also EU members, not Great Britain anymore, but everybody else was. So you say, okay, we're covered.
We are covered. So I think that was not realistic, and that should not be the case again in Ukraine's case. Though there are some differences as well, like the geography, the neighborhood, and much more. But again, the enemy or the other side here, Russia, is a bigger power. Many EU member countries may not want to kind of go to another war with them. With the Taliban was just a group. They didn't stay. And in this case, the risk is bigger. It's a full war escalation. I mean, feasibility of that. So that's why I think that should be also noted, that no other country can replace the US and the leadership of the US. And I will go back to the chronology of the events when nowadays today, I heard that Kremlin says that there is a cautious optimism for a ceasefire. We had also ceasefires with the Taliban, the Afghan government, and also the US. The US had a longer one. For a year, the Taliban did not attack any American soldiers, and the US also did not attack the Taliban. During the ceasefires and during the peace talks, the Afghan government had a different approach. President Ashraf Ghani was thinking that postponing or delaying the peace talks, not going to a conclusion soon, will give us the chance to see another president in the White House, and that will have a different mindset. So we can have a different approach to the peace talks. But that was not the right idea. Postponing the peace talks and kind of beating around the bush. I remember when our delegation for peace talks was going to Doha. In some ways, they had chances to talk to other people and then give the message to the Taliban. mostly their talks. Yeah, first of all, the government was not allowed to talk to the Taliban, or the Taliban did not talk to the government, but there was a group created from the political groups of Afghanistan. And when that group was going, the lead was somehow with the few ministers and representatives of the Afghan government. They were given the points or talking points that were not very important. They were just very unimportant things. But the main plan was to keep or to make those meetings useless and waste time or buy time. I mean, like to delay. So this administration will not conclude it. It will go to another president. And that did not help us. Postponing the peace talks are bringing up useless issues and topics or agendas to the table and not talking about the real thing, the real problems, and not taking these talks seriously was another mistake at that time made by the Afghan side.
Let me ask you this, because again, now we know what happened in the end, but was there at any, notwithstanding the fact that how these peace talks were framed, meaning the United States government talks directly to the Taliban, over the head of the so-called legitimate government in Kabul, which obviously didn't sit well with you in the government. And I suppose to the extent that we can talk about an Afghan public opinion, such as it was, people kind of knew that this was going on, right? I mean,
Yes.
people didn't say, "Oh my God, this is really wonderful," they're negotiating without our government. This is really exactly how we like it. But was there still any residual hope that the talks led by Ambassador Khalizad from the US side could lead to genuine reconciliation? Because people talk about power sharing. Basically, if I recall, please correct me if I'm wrong, because obviously I don't know intimately the details. But the deal was, okay, the Taliban would come in as join the civilian government, and the only real big deal for us, no terrorists. Okay, that under whatever the new government will be, a coalition government, but there will be a pledge that the Taliban will never again play footsie with Al Qaeda or any other such organization or offshoot. That was the deal, right? This is what the Americans insisted on.
Yes.
And then, but they was it really a dream at that point to say we're going to negotiate a power sharing with the Ghani government that the Taliban all the time insisted it's not a legitimate government, it's a puppet of the Americans. We don't even want to talk to them. That said, how do you merge with them in a new national reconciliation, government? How, how was it perceived at that time? That there was any shred of a chance that this would work the way it was conducted?
In the beginning, yes. In the beginning, when the peace talks started, some people fed up with the status quo, the daily casualties, the attacks, suicide attacks within the cities, uh, and all the losses of the Afghan army and also the civilians, and on the other side as well. People wanted an end to that. Uh, but there were some cautious expectations, or there were also some concerns that the right points were not pushed in many stages. For 20 years almost, the people told to the world that the real problem is not within. The real problem is in Pakistan. The real problem is the Taliban offices in Quetta or in Peshawar, where they are managing, where they are planning the attacks and everything within Afghanistan. The Taliban leaders should be restricted there, or the main places should be attacked, as Al-Qaeda's leader is being killed in Pakistan, as Taliban's leader, Mullah Mansour, is being killed in Pakistan by the US. Other offices of the Taliban should also be bombed there, so we can have an upper hand in the negotiations. But Pakistan played kind of very negative role in all that. And I remember when the Taliban took over Kabul, the defense minister of Pakistan tweeted on social media, on X, to the US that if you have power, we have God. So he perceived this as the victory of Pakistan against the US. And Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan also tweeted, at that time it was Twitter, so tweeted that the Afghans broke the chains of slavery. While a prime minister is considering the US presence chains of slavery, then how could that help the peace process? You see, so people used to have concerns about all that stuff that were not considered. But coming back to the mistakes we made, I remember there were some kind of resistance ideas or resisting groups to the peace talks in Kabul, and those actually caused to miss the opportunities of peace for Afghanistan in the earlier stages. Even in 2019, I remember one day we were asked to the State Department, and we were told to convey the message to Kabul that you should tell back to the UN that Mullah Baradar, the Taliban leader for the Doha talks, who is now the vice prime minister of the Taliban, he should be allowed to travel to Doha, so he can talk with the US. And we realized that our representative to the UN was instructed to ask restrictions on his travel, so our travel ban on him. So our government, instead of participating or facilitating the peace talks, tried to kind of block the ways for the peace talks. And that was somehow losing chances. And when there were talks in Doha, and there were talks in Kabul, like Saul and other US diplomats were talking to the other Afghan leaders, to the chief executive Abdullah, and to Hamid Karzai, the former president. There was a decision that government led by someone else, as a transition government, should take power, so the peace talks can have a conclusion and the power sharing deal can be implemented. But President Ashraf Ghani was opposed to it. He said everything should happen under his supervision and he should remain president. He did not listen to anyone. And in the end, the US started withdrawing troops in May, and then the Taliban started taking provinces one by one in August. And on August 15, the Taliban almost entered Kabul, and President Ashraf Ghani, with his very small team, fled the country in helicopters, not informing anyone. I was in office. His personal assistant was a close friend of mine. And I was in office when he texted me that PG, President Ghani, PG fled. That was the only message I got. I was a deputy minister for arts and culture of Afghanistan at that time. And after an hour, when I decided to leave office to collect my personal stuff, belongings, and saw that even my drivers had left, there was no one to give me a ride. And the streets, unfortunately, the streets of Kabul that day were blocked by traffic, like all cars. Some people were leaving their cars in the middle of the road, just running away. Some were going to the airport, uh, and then I saw everything collapsing in front of my eyes, and thinking all about all those decisions and those stages that we had, the chances we had. I think we made those mistakes, and going through one by one, I think it's important to Ukraine to take notes of the mistakes we made in dealing with the war, in dealing with our own people, in dealing with a world power that's supporting or a supporter, the United States, and dealing with other diplomats, other organizations such as NATO and the EU, and also to foresee and to have a foresight of the consequences of all these decisions. So the sooner the better to manage things and to have an upper hand, or to have at least some cards in hand, not talking once the cards are lost, or not talking once the allies are lost, or not leaving in a way President Ashraf Ghani left. And now thinking about the days, any kind of power sharing deal would have been better than a full power of the Taliban banning women from work, girls from education, and also the economy contracted, and the country has turned literally to a prison, to a bigger prison for many people. While talking to you right now, my younger brother is in their jail of intelligence. Many of my family members, like I hear from many, are suffering, and I see suicide cases of many young people who are educated, but they don't have uh, anything to eat because the Taliban soldiers have taken all the jobs. And the foreign organizations are also controlled by the Taliban. So there are no job opportunities for the educated people who were educated before. Modern education has no place in their policies. They only believe in religious education. And almost all those who have worked for the previous government are considered non-Muslims to them. And the country is in a dark stage. So I think if we could talk to the Taliban in 2001, or we could reach to a conclusion, or if we could do in 2012 or 13 or 18 or 19, even 20 and 21, that power sharing deal would have been better than the current situation we have. So the sooner the better for those who are going through the same stages. And also there are differences as well, but similarities are more.
Thank you. Thank you very much. But again, if we can push this a little further, and again, obviously, it's really, these are different situations. Afghanistan, Ukraine, there are similarities, as you pointed out, and some of the characters are the same. The United States government to begin with, and the European countries, whether it was within the NATO context in the case of Afghanistan, and now, whoever wants to volunteer things, etc. And you say, talk now rather than later, how do you, so I asked you before, and of course, this is everybody's guess. I asked you before, do you think that the Taliban would have been agreeable to a genuine power sharing instead of taking the power sharing agreement as a pretext to come in and then take over again? And you said, who knows, that might have been better than what it is now anyway. Now, of course, trying to pretend to be, great strategist here, but Mr. Zelenskyy is told you need to have peace, and he says yes, but I don't trust the Russians. We signed all kinds of things with the Russians in the past. they never respected the agreements. So we need guarantees. And that was led to that animated discussion, to use polite language, in the White House several days ago, which kind of left, you know, a few things were broken that day. So, but the question is, given all this, it is still, you say, Mr. Zelenskyy, take it from somebody who's been through this, negotiate now, not tomorrow. That's still your, even cognizant of the complexity of all the, and don't say, oh, the US is dropping us. Hey, no big deal. We got the Europeans here who are our strong and resilient allies. They're going to help us. And you say, not really. It's not going to work. So that's basically, can you elaborate on that? And again, keeping in mind that obviously he's trying to, you know, save his country, maybe also his own reputation. He's the leader of the resistance. He says, essentially, I lost. Well, not entirely, because the country has not been taken over, but he's losing, most likely, whatever peace agreement there will be. I very much doubt that the Russians are going to withdraw from the areas they control. In fact, as we speak, they have this effort to take over again the portion of Russia that the Ukrainians had taken over, the Kursk region, to say there's not going to be any bargaining. You know, we give you this and we give us that, because there will be nothing there. And so the Russians want to negotiate from a position of strength, and it doesn't seem that the Ukrainians are able to do anything about it. That said, you would say, take the deal, because better than no deal.
That's what I said. Like, any kind of deal would have been better than the current situation in Afghanistan. I have sympathy for the people of Ukraine, for their losses, for the sufferings they're going through. But it needs an end, and the soonest the situation get to a better end is the better. So I think that's one point. And the second point is mishandling our kind of mismanaging the relations with the supporters, with the allies. In this case, is another thing. There should be a consideration of that as well, like the U.S. Especially. So I know when it comes to personal behavior, when it comes to personal reactions and actions, in some cases, the trauma of the war, the feelings of a leader might be in a way that it may be kind of provoking or kind of out of the norms. But when talking about on behalf of a nation, to a leader of a nation, or to the leaders of a nation, I think a better approach that is based in considering the consequences is also important. I saw some commending the frankness or the outspokenness in the White House, but I also saw that how he lost his very close allies in the Republicans as well, and I saw how the people reacted to him. So I think all those points should be considered, and all those points we in politics among nations need to make decisions that protect the interests of the nations in a broader way. And we, while using rhetorics of, victory and power and much more, but in the meantime, while we should also assess our weak points as well, our losing cards as well. We see the internal dynamics in Ukraine as well, the groups, the ethnic groups, and And the fractions or the factions, though in some cases they might get united, but in a long term, they might not stay that way. One of the weakening points of the Afghan government or the Afghan position in the peace talks was the internal uh, fractions or the conflicts within, or you can say the various groups with no agreement on a unified issue or solution was one of the points. So I think with the time, those things also happen, or those things increase. So that's one thing I think that should be considered. And in the meantime, the power politics or the big powers in the international politics should also be considered. In some cases, some countries do not see involvement in long or unending wars at their interest. And they make their decisions and they make their policies, and those decisions should also be trusted. And the support should not be expected forever. No country owes another country forever. And every country has its own interests and policies based on those interests. So I think a solution is always needed. And the new president of the US, or President Trump, is willing to be remembered as a peacemaker, as he wants, as he says. And I think he is trying to narrow down his focus on his you can say rival nations, and I think he wants Russia not to be in the bloc that's against the US. And I think he wants Russia detached, which is as a common understanding, detached from China, while US is.
You're raising a very good point here, and I've heard this observation, this analysis made by many other people.
Yes.
Who say, well, that's, you really want to know what's going on here, that it's given, broad geopolitics. What the United States sees is that there's an opportunity of a rapprochement with Russia, close this deal, be a peacemaker, and as you say, this is part of a strategy to help, if I can use this word, or to provoke a detachment from Russia, from China, because by ganging up against Russia, we favor this embrace, because Russia has no place to go. So where does it go? It goes to China, and this is against our interests. And so we can figure a way to bring them to our side. And people actually make the analogy, well, that's exactly what Nixon did, President Nixon, by going to China, which at that point was the junior partner in a broader communist alliance, so led by the Soviet Union. But the Chinese had problems with the Soviet Union, and so we went to China, detached China from, and so this was considered a great, success. And people say, okay, we're going to do the same thing this time, detaching Russia, which is now the junior partner in this arrangement, from China, which is our real problem. Some people have said that, and I don't know, now we're going to a different area here, but I'm curious to know, you as a diplomat, how you see it. Said Putin is not going to buy this, because he's going to say, this is what the Americans say today. What about tomorrow? At some point, there will be no President Trump. There'll be someone else, whoever that will be, a Republican after the next election, or a Democrat. Will they continue, or they're going to throw us away? And therefore we are alone, twisting in the wind. We have no America as a partner, and we don't have China, and therefore they're not going to buy this. how do you view all this? I mean, it's a very interesting theory to say, hey, there's a plan here, and unfortunately, we have to sacrifice Ukraine, which is really not such a big deal from a geopolitical standpoint, but the prize is rapprochement with Russia, which is really a big deal. And that therefore we assume that Russia is going to bite and to say, okay, well, that sounds interesting. Oh, what do you propose? Oh, we're going to do this and that together. Oh, this looks better than China. Do you see this? How do you see this? I mean, we're speculating, obviously. We don't really know all the facts.
Who knows who the next president will be? But I think Russia sees it, I think, from a point like it will be more clear tomorrow after the talks between the two presidents. But since there is a cautious optimism we hear from the Kremlin, seems they are buying it for now. And if even it's not being bought by the Russians right now, anything that happens regarding the detachment of Russia from China and giving the US a chance to focus on China and its trade war with other countries, and also the reforms that President Trump intends for his country over here, I think he will have a clear focus over here, and much more. Not only that, but also reducing the costs for the U.S. Spending billions and billions in Ukraine is not something that President Trump wants. I think there is one more point which is very important, and that has been of importance to President Trump as well. That's the energy security or the energy new routes in between Russia, India, and China. Since the war of Ukraine and the reduction of dependence of EU on Russian gas and oil, and a kind of tendency towards green energy, there has been new pipelines and new trade lines of energy between other countries. India is now a big buyer of Russian gas and oil.
Yeah, oil particularly.
Particularly oil. And India is then again, while there is a ban or there is the restrictions on Russian oil and gas, India is then selling the same Russian oil again to other countries. And China on the other side. And President Putin, I think, is the only leader of the world who has a PhD in using energy security as an offensive weapon. And he has been using that. So that's another thing. While we are in a transition from the fossil fuels to green energy, and while China is a big power in green energy, the number one, from the solar panels to the wind turbines to the rare earth minerals and to strategic and critical minerals, China has the bigger portion of those minerals, and in the meantime, the processing capacity within. So that's something else that I think is important for the Trump administration. And I think these talks or the end to this war will give the chance to the Trump administration to focus on those topics.
Let me ask you, I'm sorry, not to belabor too much on this, and this is all hypothetical, and probably at this stage completely beside the point. There was a school of thought that said, oh, no, this approach is completely wrong. We should really not only continue to support the war in Ukraine, meaning give armaments to Zelenskyy, but double down, give them a lot more, because in our estimate, Russia is close to a breaking point, meaning they are exhausted. There's a population problem in Russia, there's manpower problem, They have to get the North Koreans, you know, as cannon fodder on the front. They need, according to some estimates, about 5 million factory workers for the defense industries in Russia that they don't have because the people are gone or dead or what have you. And therefore, from this perspective, time works on our side, the good guys. So we double down, we give more money, more resources, more weapons to Zelenskyy, and Russia will break because they will not be able to sustain the effort economically. There will be huge problems. They will not be able to throw in the front lines. That's partially true. We know the Russians are sending to the front old Soviet weapons because they don't have the new stuff. They can't make enough of it. So there was a school of thought that says this is a terrible mistake. We should really double down and not make this a forever war, but Zelenskyy will win. Ukraine will win. Of course, this conversation is not taking place. What's your view? Do you think that had any standing at all to say if we're really resilient and double down, meaning give more weapons, more offensive weapons, give the airplanes, give all that stuff to Zelenskyy, and then the Russians, who incidentally have had obviously significant success, but that's it. You know, in 3 years, they took over 20% of Ukraine. They thought they were going to take over the country in 2 weeks back in 2022. What do you make of these theories and schools of thought, which, again, I don't think at this point they have much currency because we're not going that way. Nobody's going to give the weapons to Zelenskyy to, quote, win the war in the military sense. Not America and Europe, as much as it says that it's going to do stuff, they just don't have it, you know? So what do you make of this?
I think the exhaustion strategy was used by President Reagan as well against the Soviets in Afghanistan to exhaust them there and keep them there for a longer time. And it worked at that time. The Soviet Union eventually collapsed, turned into Russia. But at this time, I think there are other big powers such as China and many others on the Russian side as well. So I think it won't be that easy as it was in the late 80s. And one more point, keeping the war going is not cheap for the US. It's costly. It also costs the lives and economy and stability and everything of Ukraine as well. So I think that can be a hypothesis, but eventually, who guarantees that Russia will eventually get exhausted and victory will be on the side of the Ukrainians? That is not also a guaranteed option.
Of course. Well, I think we're getting close to the end of our time, ladies and gentlemen. Do we have any questions? No, from the audience, we do not. Oh, you have a question, then wait a minute. Take this.
Salam.
Alaikum.
Aziz, glad to have you here.
Please identify yourself. I know who you are, but for everybody else.
Okay, myself, I'm Qahidayat. I'm a student here, and my professor. I have a couple of questions regarding Afghanistan, but I'm going to take it very short. It's regarding the fall of Afghanistan. As you mentioned that the fall, do you think that the fall was a victory for Taliban and a major victory for Taliban as per they considered their Trump, and a loss for America since they were investing like 20 years on Afghanistan, like millions, billions of dollars. And as you said that you mentioned a very insightful point that only peace talks can, or negotiation can make the countries to keep them from war. Do you think these peace talks today, we as a woman, we're trying to have with Taliban, like we are activists. Our activism, do you think can bring any change, or can make the Taliban change their mind or decision to negotiate with Afghan women so we can have our rights? And what do you think is our role as a new generation for the future of Afghanistan? Do you think this regime will stay, or we can have a better other ways or negotiation with the Taliban, or there will be a civil war or any other war in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Oh, important questions. Taliban occupied, kind of rebuilt Afghanistan. When in 2001 they left Kabul, Afghanistan's many provinces were war affected, ruined, and no infrastructure because of the wars against the Soviets, and then the wars between the Mujahideen, and then they were also fighting the Northern Alliance for almost 5 years. So Afghanistan was a ruin at that time. But in 2021, they returned to an Afghanistan that, as Mr. Paulo mentioned, was rebuilt, and hundreds of billions were invested in that country. And the occupied mansions of the previous Afghan government officials, in the occupied bulletproof new model vehicles, and they occupied a very expensive lifestyle of you can say many people don't have even in developed countries. So they celebrated it as a victory. They still call it even Fatah. Fatah is a word when one country occupies another country, but they consider Afghanistan as a country that is occupied by them. So they do celebrate it like that. But the U.S. left with a peace deal. The U.S. left on the terms that no American soldier was attacked during the 1 year after the peace deal. And they were taking care of the U.S. troops or protecting the U.S. troops during the last few days. I saw when I was going to the airport, an American officer was escorting me, and around there were Taliban who were pulling my bag, who were not letting me go, but they didn't say anything to the American soldier. It was surprising. The people who they were fighting with, we were being killed just because of working for the Americans. But that time, they were taking care of the Americans and not letting us go. Coming to the point of the negotiations right now. Right now, as I mentioned, the soonest the peace talks or the soonest the negotiations, the better. Now we are in a very, very weak position. Like the Afghan women wants to talk to the Taliban. Now they don't talk. They don't need to talk, unfortunately. But there are groups within them. You might have heard that their acting minister of Interior Affairs, who was managing the suicide attackers, almost 10,000 sent to Afghanistan to kill innocent people in the cities. Now he is a moderate person and he believes in women's rights, but their leader does not believe in that. So now he is not going to his office in a kind of protesting that the leader should listen to them. The leader should allow women to go to schools. So in case of a change in their policies or mindsets to talk to the Afghan women, then for sure talks will have a result. And coming to the point of their their future, I don't think a government can last this way. They are not acting as a government. They are not acting. They don't know how to run the country. They kept some of the former government lower officials to teach their soldiers how to run those offices, and after a while, they fired them. But I think their own soldiers, their own people, are the people who supported them will turn against them eventually. That's one thing. There was a hope that we will have a resistance to the Taliban or some groups. I don't have any hope in them. I don't expect anything from them so far, though there are some in DC, some in Europe, but they have a rare presence on the ground so far, and they're only acting as political activists so far. But still, there is a hope. First of all, they will change. Their new generation will take over, and also that the people will realize, and eventually the international community will realize that there is a change needed in that country.
One last question. I'm so sorry. I wanted to add that.
Actually, we kind of run out of
It's
time.
very short.
Oh, please go ahead then,
Yeah.
quickly.
So, Hakimi said, as you worked very closely with the government, do you think the fall was a pre-plan? Because since especially with having all that military resources, the government didn't try to defeat the country by they didn't even shot a fire. They didn't fire the shot. Am I correct? So it was a pre-plan because the president leave the country and then
Nothing was pre-planned. Nothing. The president went in a way to outside the country that Tajikistan did not allow his helicopters to land. He then risked his life and took the border or the Amur River over the Amur River and asked the Uzbekistani radar to allow his helicopters. They did not allow him. And eventually they took the risk that whether being killed or not, they didn't have any fuel in the helicopters. That was the limit they could travel, and they landed there. And there, only the president and two people were allowed to go. The rest, the people who had gone with the president, were kept there like prisoners and not allowed to go to bathrooms for almost 24 hours. No food, nothing was given to them. We hear like nasty stories about the high level officials who went with the president. If anything was pre-planned, it wouldn't be the scenario. So no, it was not. I know how he then left Uzbekistan for UAE. I know how the passport was printed in UAE for him. A photo was downloaded from internet, and ambassador had just prepared a passport. He had no passport when he was coming to the UAE. The ambassador at that time there went to the airplane and gave him a passport printed in UAE. So he even didn't have a passport. So it was not a pre-planned thing.
Well, on this rather sobering note, Harun, thank you very much for giving us many different insights, of course, from your own not only personal experience, but also scholarly reflections on all these complex matters. And indeed, if there's a takeaway from this is negotiating is better than not negotiating, and negotiating early is better than negotiating late. Okay, if that's in summary, the crux of what you've said, and the take home would be this. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for all those who have followed us online. Again, on behalf of the Global Policy Institute and Bay Atlantic University, we stand adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harun.
Thank you.
تشكر
خير
بسبب
وقت.
شلون شدم
ما فكرت الموضوع أنا إذا
هاي امیدوارم که ان شاء الله